Hello, I hope you're doing well today. Thank you for tuning in to this second part of our lecture over the 60s. What's happening in the 60s? Um, if you haven't watched the video from before, the part one of this four-part lecture over the 60s, I encourage you to do that. As for announcements, this is technically the last week before our spring break, right? So remember that when you get back from spring break, on August 12th, I believe, is the official due date of your SLO paper. And if I was you, I would want to get this done as soon as possible. Um, and if you have any questions about it, I encourage you to email me and stuff. Also, keep in mind that your chapter 27, I believe, your chapter 27 quiz and discussion post is also due this Sunday by midnight, right? So I encourage you to get that stuff done. Like I said before, and in the announcements page, check Blackboard. Um, I want you to make sure that you're staying on top of these assignments, especially now when pretty much every week until the end of the semester you have some sort of major assignment due, right? You still have your museum review, your oral history review. You have your last reflection paper along with your quizzes and stuff, right? So let's finish strong. Today, I hope you'll find this lecture pretty interesting. We're going to be talking about what's happening culturally with what's going on in the 60s, right? We mentioned a little bit of that with the civil rights movement in our last lecture. But today we're going to move past the civil rights movement a bit and talk about the other things that are happening, like the hippies, right? Always an interesting topic that we're going to talk about. All right, so uh, for today, the possible essay question for your final is describe the civil rights movements of the 1960s, right? So describe what these movements are, right? It's not only Martin Luther King, but also, as we'll talk about today, there's a Native American civil rights movement, a Black Power movement with Malcolm X. Also, there's a Mexican American civil rights movement taking place at this time. But also, there's a peace and love movement inspired by the hippies, right? That we'll talk about in just a little bit. So there's a lot of things that I expect you to write about if you choose to write about this final topic for the final exam. All right, so as I mentioned before, after World War II, going into the 1950s, America was going through some of the most prosperous times that it's ever had in our history. Um, there was a increase of jobs, right? We just got out of the Depression, and the United States economy was booming. You also have this um, big heightened consumerism that's taking place in the 50s too. You have new appliances coming out, like the vacuum cleaner, the dishwasher, refrigerators, and eventually microwaves too, coming up later in the decade. So a heightened sense of consumerism at this point, and there's a strict regimen that we'll talk about of what women are expected to do at this time, what men are expected to do. Also, this is during the 50s. There was this heightened moment of segregation, right, which got pushed back on during the civil rights movement of the 60s, right. So going into the 60s, there were a lot of problems in America coming up beneath the surface. Even though in the 50s America was booming economically, socially, there were a lot of cracks beneath the surface that started to eventually come out during the 60s. We talked about the civil rights movement in our last class, but today we're going to move past that and talk about what's happening with these younger generations of people who are standing up and protesting and wanting to make a difference in the United States to make it better, right? They're seeing the wrongs of the world and they're criticizing that, right? When in the 50s is very much the status quo, everything's all right. When we get into the 60s, these younger generations are saying everything's not all right. There's some serious problems in the world, and we need to fix it. So, um, we mentioned in our Cold War lecture the Vietnam War and its place within the Cold War. Now, for this, I'll just quickly go over what's happening in the Vietnam War, how did it start, and all that good stuff. So, uh, remember I said in 1949, China became a communist country under Mao Zedong, right? So the United States, especially in this early Cold War period, they were freaking out because of communism. They thought that if one country fell to communism, like China, then it would inspire all these countries across Asia to follow suit and become communist as well. It's what we called the domino effect, remember? Um, so, so in order to prevent this, the United States had this policy of containment, right? Contain communism where it starts so it can't spread to these other countries. They treat it like a virus or something. This started out with the first war, which was the Korean War, right? Which ended up in a stalemate between North and South Korea. But the second war we talked about was the Vietnam War. We said that the UN decided to split Vietnam up between the North and the South. The North led by the communist leader Ho Chi Minh, and the South led by a more Western world, American-leaning president. So so eventually, Ho Chi Minh decided to invade South Vietnam, and this led to the beginning of the Vietnam War. U.S. Marines finally landed in Vietnam in March of 1965, and this began the American Ground War. So we'll get into how Vietnam ended and stuff in our next class, so when we talk about the 70s. But the big thing is that by 1968, so only a few years later, 500,000 American troops were stationed in Vietnam, and nearly 20,000 had been killed. And even though 20,000 American troops died during this 3-year period, the war was still no closer from being won, right? And this was one of the first fully televised wars, right? So reporters came into Vietnam and they showed people on the news how the war was going, and that was not going well for the Americans. So there was this huge backlash, especially amongst younger generations of people during the Vietnam War. And especially the hippies, we'll talk about them in just a second, but they came forth and sort of preached anti-war, right? That we don't belong in Vietnam, and that the U.S. is just sending young men to their deaths for no real reason. So we'll get more into that in a little bit. But right now, I really want to. I'll discuss this. Some of the other changes that are taking part in the '60s. So a big cultural change that happened at this time was Pope John the 23rd called for a Second Vatican Council, also called Vatican II. You should know this, but the Pope, leader of the Catholic Church, right? He has this power to hold councils, and the whole purpose of Vatican II was try to modernize the Catholic Church. This slide here says that a total of 2,600 bishops from all over the world came over, along with 3,000 other participants to try to solve this issue of how do we reform the church? How do we make it better? Really in the 60s, up until this point, the Catholic Church, it was going through some problems. They were facing the issue of being in a modern world, but not modernizing themselves, right? That they experienced low church attendance, and a downturn of Catholicism around the world. So in order to address this, Vatican II was held between 1962 and 1965 to modernize the Catholic Church and make it more accessible to the modern world. So some of the things they did was to make it more accessible is they decided to hold mass in the vernacular, right? So that means the local language of the country, right? So can you imagine going to a church where the preacher is talking an entirely different language that you or everyone else around you did not know? This is how it's been done really for over 1,000 years in the Catholic Church by this point. Most masses were held in Latin, and most people grew up just not knowing a single word of what their priest was actually saying. So in order to address this, make it more accessible, the Vatican II, among other things, it decided that that mass could be held in the vernacular, right? That now in America you could attend a Catholic mass and it be taught in English, which was a huge deal. Also, they did more social outreach projects around the world. They led aid programs all across the decolonizing third world, right? So places like Africa and Asia, there were tons of missions going in there trying to provide aid and stuff. And all this, the purposes of this Vatican II was to make the Catholic Church more accessible, right? And in reality, this was largely successful. Vatican II sort of built the foundations of the modern Catholic Church that exists today. Now, modern projections show that that due to Latin American immigration to the United States in the past several decades, in the future, around like 50, 60 years from now, the two largest Christian denominations will in the United States will be Catholic and some form of non-denominational Christianity. Part of this reason for a growing number is because the growing number of atheists and non-Christians in the modern world. We see this in like Europe and stuff. We have empty churches, record low of church attendance because people just aren't going to churches that much in Europe anymore. But the United States, we have a different background. We have this religious background that we've stood on since really our origin. So church retention and religious retention in the United States is fairly large, but in some denominations, some Christian denominations are really struggling with this issue of church retention, right? That it needs to be a balance between how much do we need to modernize to accommodate this new modern population of churchgoers, and what do we need to do to make sure they keep coming back to the church. So the same sort of issues that Christian denominations are facing now with church retention in the modern world, people in the 60s, especially the Catholic Church, had to face and come up with, right? How do we fix these things? So it'll be interesting to see how modern Christianity deals with these issues going forward. But going back into the 60s, the Vatican II is this testament of these churches changing, trying to modernize, and trying to accommodate their populations to make sure they don't just dissolve, right? So it'll be interesting to think about, and just connecting modern Christianity in the United States to what happened in the 1960s. You definitely see some parallels there. Also, I will say that you see a lot of parallels between the 60s in the United States today as well. This major transitional moment, just like the 60s was. The 60s was this major transitional social moment in American history. I believe that we are now, as a country, possibly entering another transitional moment. So we'll see how that happens. But this goes to show that that the times that we're living in, they could be historical events, especially they are now with this whole world that we're living in today because of the pandemic. So interesting things to keep in mind. All right, so now we're going to get into the hippie movement, right? This countercultural movement that took place in the 1960s. Like I said, 60s is this big transitional moment, a rejection of what people thought standard society should be in the 1950s, and acceptance of there could be another way. There could be a better way on how to do this, right? And so in the 60s, there was this major countercultural movement, right? This rejection of the ideology of the 50s that you should fit in by having the right job, right? Women should work certain jobs. That there was a home sphere to live in, right, with women and children. Women are supposed to be good wives and not really supposed to leave the house besides for minor social functions, but also the man was supposed to go and be the breadwinner of the house, right? These were some of the social expectations of the world today, especially buying modern appliances, right? Trying to show that you are that you're part of this modern society. Think back to those Jello molds and stuff, right? With Spaghetti-O Jello Jello molds. In the 50s, this really became popular because households would hold parties and stuff, and they would invite people over and say like, hey, look at this cool Jello mold I made full of SpaghettiOs, right? It's all about being modern, being a consumerist, and being a good American, right? And this is also during the time where American values were sort of made more apparent, especially during the fear of communism during the Cold War. But as we entered the 60s, we see a big difference in this approach, especially amongst younger generations. So this is where we get things like the hippie movement, right? Hippies, it comes from this term of being hip, that you were either square, right, or you were hip, you were cool. And this was really amongst these younger generations of people in the United States. And the sort of vehicle to encapsulate this hippie movement was really the German car company Volkswagen. They marketed their VW Beetle. I'm sure you've seen a Beetle before. And they marketed that as the hippie car, right? The car for young hip people, that everyone needs to have that. Also, VW came out with like one of those big Volkswagen vans and stuff. And part of that appeal of Volkswagen actually came from its different design, right? That compared to other American car companies like Ford and stuff, the Volkswagen looked completely different, right? The VW Beetle is very unique, and you could really spot it out. And in order to, for the hippies, right, as this countercultural movement, they sort of gravitated around things like Beetles. So also in the 60s, there was this huge musical counterculture movement. For example, Columbia Records, one of the largest American record companies at the time, decided to rebrand itself and decided to produce and sponsor many bands and musical groups that otherwise a decade earlier they would not have supported. People with long shaggy hair, right? Rebellious types singing about politics and counter politics, right? Anti-war songs. And Columbia Records really held these people up and decided to rebrand itself for the younger generation of people who decide to watch these, listen to these songs. There are also all sorts of musical groups who came out at this time, like the Grateful Dead and the Rolling Stones, Jefferson Airplane, and Jimi Hendrix, who all were major musicians at the time, music groups at the time. But as we see in many of these songs, they actually had some political leanings to them. A lot of these songs were anti-war songs, and talked about the struggles of the time. So in 1969, there was this big music festival that happened, um, and it was called Woodstock, right? So 1969, you have Woodstock, where we see many of these performers performed in front of like over 200,000 people. So huge. Bands like the Grateful Dead, Rolling Stones, Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix, they all gathered at this music festival known as Woodstocks, where they promoted sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? And in many of these songs, they talked about the struggles of the time, right? Anti-war. A lot of these groups and a lot of hippies at this time were anti-Vietnam. They believed that we should not belong in Vietnam, and that they produced songs against that. And one of the most known performances of Woodstock was actually Jimi Hendrix. He came on last on stage, and performed in front of a smaller crowd and stuff, but that made it more intimate, right? Between Jimi Hendrix, one of the greatest guitarists in rock and roll history, and he gave this whole rendition of the Star Spangled Banner, our national anthem. And let me just play you a clip of it real quick, if I could get to it. So this is him at Woodstock. I'll stop it there. It goes on for another 4 minutes. But it was really cool at that time. And I enjoy it now too. But it goes to show that that many of these musicians, they were, one, proud of being American, but two, they were willing to go against these traditional standardized norms that was expected in America. They wanted to go against the expected, to provide a counterculture of something that possibly could be better, right? They promoted love and peace and community instead of focusing on the individual. So Star Spangled Banner, it's our national anthem, right? But Jimi Hendrix performed this alternate form of it, that was a little bit more rock and roll, a little bit more modern, but also as a slight criticism of the times that they were living in, especially during this time of Vietnam, where it was a vastly growing unpopular war that people did not really support. So also there were other musicians at this time, like Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan great musician. He used folk music, a sound which was inherently traditional American music, right? Folksy music, but with a more modern twist. And Bob Dylan used some of his music to promote uh, and talk about some of the problems that occurred in the United States. There's a good song by Bob Dylan called "The Times They Are Changing," and I encourage you to listen to that song. Great song. It came out on October of 1963, right, 1 month before JFK was assassinated. Um, and also, I just uh, as I was writing this lecture and stuff, I came across Bob Dylan actually, like only a few days ago, he wrote a song about JFK's assassination. I posted it on Blackboard under a link and stuff, so I encourage you to look at that. Um, and because I thought it was pretty interesting that we just talked about JFK's assassination and stuff, and then Bob Dylan just randomly came out with this song about it only a few days ago. So very interesting, and it goes to show that music itself could be a primary source tool to understand history, right? That some of these songs were written at the time and inspired by current events of that time, and sort of response about what they thought about it, right? So music history is very interesting. Anyway, I encourage you to go on Pandora or Spotify this week and listen to some 60s music, right? And see if you could hear anything in these songs that remark about the time. Now, not all 60s music at this time was a political statement by all means, right? You have things like the Beach Boys and stuff. I don't think many of their songs were political at all. But you do have some groups that really did speak out against the wrongs that they saw in society and wanted to make a difference through their music, which I thought is pretty interesting. So again, I encourage you to just go on Pandora or Spotify in the background, listen to some 60s music, right? Um, it's pretty interesting. Now, so let's just go over who these hippies were, right? Also, I provide a link to that Jimi Hendrix video in this PowerPoint. So these many of these hippies were symbols of this countercultural movement of the 1960s. They rebelled against the establishment, against consumerism, against war, and against capitalism. Um, so many of them were actually college students, right? College students on college campuses who are learning these things, right? People around your age, and learning these things about the world and saying like, "Hey, that's messed up," and wanted a alternate way, right? Not just the way that their parents or grandparents wanted them to live their life. Um, but a side effect of that was a new hallucinogenic drug, LSD, began its life primarily as a psychological research tool, but then it got to the college campuses and out into society at large. So part of this countercultural notion was that American stagnation can be remedied by spiritual psychedelic experiences, which spurred a huge increase of drug usage during the 60s. And LSD was a very potent hallucinogenic drug that was used by a lot of hippies at this time. Um, so many of these college students, young hippies and stuff, took LSD in order to go on some sort of spiritual journey or something to break the stagnation of American life and learn something about themselves. By 1966, enough incidents had been connected to LSD to spur the Senate from hearing the drug, um, and and um, and the Senate deemed LSD officially illegal and tried to crack down on it. but people throughout the 60s continued to use it. I'm sure at Woodstock, right, in 1969, a lot of people used drugs like LSD, marijuana, which became very popular and used at this time. I hope you enjoyed this first part of our lecture over the 60s, right? We're going to continue that in our next lecture, right? So please stay tuned to that. I'm going to post both of these videos at the same time, so you could just view both of them. And that concludes part 3 of our lecture over the 60s. Go ahead and watch part 4 of this video. It will be pretty interesting talking about the other civil rights movements that are happening at this time. All right, all right, I'll see you in the next video.